Good morning, everyone. I would like to begin firstly by thanking the organizers of this wonderful conference in this wonderful place, Halifax. The weather has been so great. We've not only sort of walked around, but we've enjoyed the food and the scenery and everything. And we hope that, we will be getting back fond memories of both this conference and the city when we get back. But I would also like to particularly thank Gordon over there, without whom we could not have liaised and brought this together, as well as Melanie Frappier and Megan and Alan, who's managing the technology here. Now, this conference, just to give you a kind of a background, is being sponsored by the Joseph Needham Foundation for Science and Civilization, which works closely with the Needham Research Institute in Cambridge and organize conferences, Needham Memorial Lectures and other events in a regular way. And you may have heard about these conferences. And we did a conference in Hong Kong in 2023 on multicultural exchanges in the making of modern science, for which and the volume, not of the proceedings, but selected papers from that conference, which were turned into chapters of a book that will be released in October, hopefully, by Springer. And the theme of that book is also on multicultural exchanges, and it fits very well with this conference on circulating knowledge. I think, what the books are titled Needham's Dialogical Vision, but I think the dialogical idea, the multi-civilization exchanges idea, the circulation of knowledge idea, and tangled histories ideas, and many other ways of phrasing it, all actually bring out the general global orientation in history, which recognizes that when we study the history and philosophy and sociology of science, we shouldn't just look from intra-civilizational perspectives, largely Western, but also it could be Sinocentric or Indo-centric or Islamocentric, as has also been done, but in terms of exchanges across different cultures and different civilizations. Now, I don't want to take up too much time here. This is just a background introduction. I will be calling the speakers one by one. And each will, I think two of them are coming on Zoom. And what we will do is, we have about 20 minutes for each speaker. And then after that, we might have a small amount of time for discussion. I don't know how it will go, among the speakers themselves or with you, if you have a question. So without further ado, I will call upon Dr. Peter Lee, who is the chairman of the Joseph Needham Foundation for Science and Civilization, and has been the chairman, I think, for the last 11 years, maybe more, to speak on nurturing Needham's legacy, the evolving role of the Joseph Needham Foundation for Science and Civilization. Dr. Peter.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bala. And I am very grateful thank to our organizers, to Gordon in particular, whom I met for the first time at the Needham Conference 2023 in Hong Kong. And I'm also very pleased to visit the beautiful city of Halifax, whom I have admired since I was a little young boy, taking geography class about the beautiful, terrain of this part of the country. So thanks to all the organizers and making the medium little slide or symposium will be part of the program. So without further introduction, I would like to start with fine. Yeah. As you, I'm sure most of you know who Civilisation is or was. And so without further introduction, I would like to go on to add a few words. With whom I have personal association in Cambridge. When I was there between 1975 to 77. And there was a very turbulent period for Joseph. We call him Joseph because he did not want to be called Dr. Needham. So we call him Joseph. He retired from Master of Keys in Communist Key in 1976. And as you know, with volumes and volumes of artifacts, collection of manuscript, he was hopeless. And he used to have K1 and K2 of key points. For those of you who are to key points, you know that K1 and K2. Now, after he moved out of K1 and K2, he was Stephen Hawking. And so you could see the significance of room K1 and K2. Now, when he retired in 1976, University of Cambridge, CUP, Cambridge University Press, with whom the SCC series started out, decided to put up a temporary shelter, a warehouse. And I was part of the team, we all relocated to the temporary facility. So in the early 77, Dr. Needham was concerned where to go. And fortunately, he was invited to the University of Chicago to receive an honorary degree and absent from the US for over 25 years for a reason we don't need to speculate. And I was part of the visit to the University of Chicago. At that time, it was over, President Robert and Professor Kuhn of the Department of History of Humanity. Anyhow, a small group of the US supporter, close friends, began to see the importance of raising money in the United States. So, in the late 77, the formation of a East Asian Regional Science Incorporated was established in New York. And the reason why we call it the word trust, because the money raised could not be repeated overseas, it was under trust. So the US lawyer and all the people said we need to use incorporate so we can send money, even though UK is a what we call a charity registry. So that USA Incorporated was set up in here we go. 1978. Now the original trust, which is the UK trust, before the mother trust or the father trust or whatever, was set up in 1963. Again with CUP and a very close friend within the Key College in Cambridge, because Joseph was a very financier. So we just said, just relax, focus on writing. But in the case of fundraising, it was based mostly from Asia, by Asia and Hong Kong, Singapore, and a few other countries within the Asia Pacific. The USA fundraising focused on the foundation like Carnegie Mellon, Henry Luce, Ford, and the Vanguard, the National Science Foundation. But they are mostly for operation, not for brick and mortar. So we in Hong Kong, in Asia, we realized we need to have cover. So in 1979, we changed the Hong Kong Trust also to foundation. And in 1981, that was opening in October to be precise. And Dr. Needham came to Hong Kong with, at the time, with the closest collaborator, Dr. Lu Guijin, that you have seen over a while ago. And Dr. Lu herself was a very distinguished scholar, a nutritional biochemist. And she came from a very well-established family in Nanjing. The father was a very distinguished herbalist. And she was probably the first one to go to a school to admit young lady or young women. And after she received her medical degree, she decided she needed to make a change. So we moved back to Shanghai. And then in 1937, she received a welcome trust for a PhD. So she went to the United Kingdom, and that was 1937. Within 2 years, she received her PhD under Joseph's wife, Dorothy Needham. A very interesting partnership, because Joseph himself was a biochemist, but not in muscle chemistry, more on the embryo chemistry. And he published for a very important volume on chemical embryology, and that earned him Fellow of the Royal Society in 1941. Here you get the feeling about the little group of close friends, and I was a young man with a very tough role on the left-hand side. And then we have Professor Lisotti, second from the right. Professor Lisotti himself also was a doctor, and also an anatomist, chair professor in anatomy of Hong Kong U. So we set up the trust at the very, very beginning. Just 3 of us, plus 1 from CUP. So you can see the tripartite approach to the fundraising was very critical to the success. I guess I covered the slide. So to make the whole story short, with good fortune, with God's blessing, we raised sufficient funds. We finished the building in 1991. And Chairman put him out. Some people just call him Chairman Mao. But anyhow, Philip Mao also one of the original support. You couldn't believe it, even though he was an MD, but he and I worked from the late 70s until he retired. Anyhow, so there you get a feeling about what the architecture of the library looks like. Now, to capitalize on the fundraising effort and also to show the appreciation, we designate rooms or bigger room for hall to benefactors. In this case, Mr. K.P. T.I.N. Now, Mr. K.P. himself is not a good man, but a billionaire. He was originally a Chinese from Indonesia, and he returned to Hong Kong and set up his fortune in chemical business. So KP insisted he wanted to make sure his own prescription would be precise. So I would spend any time working with him at his home. And when we sent the plate to Cambridge, it was broken. So we will do it again. But in any case, just to show you, we would like to show our appreciation to all our benefactors. So anytime you go to Cambridge and you attend a lecture at the NRI, more likely to be a small, beautiful hall, paid hall. So in 1991, we did a happy opening. And you could see we have Hong Kong Trust, USA branch, and the UK Trust all together. And just to be very precise, Dr. Needham and Louis Chen finally got married. They said the oldest marriage in the UK. She was 89 years old. And Dr. Needham was already 91. Because he was born in 1900, so we call it a very happy ending. Because after Dorothy Lloyd Needham passed away a few years earlier, Dr. Joseph Needham decided he owed tremendous gratitude to Beijing, to call her Beijing. That's why I say the bridge needed us, and he saw at the very beginning of the slide. That was what happened. To the level of Regime was chairman of the USA branch, John People. For those of you who use computer office automation, the People Corporation in USA was founded by John People. And John People happened to be also the Tom and Mara of Joseph Needham. That's why we call Charles the USA branch. Okay. And another person there, I thought I need to single out Lord Todd, Lord, I think, R-O-L-L. And Roll was standing between Mao and Ho Ping Yu. To some of you who know Ho Ping Yu was at the time director of NRI. And next to Mao and myself was Nathan Sivin. And I'm sure most of you know who know Professor Sivin. And Professor Sivin also passed away, I believe, about 2 to 3 years ago. So we all treasure all these meetings surrounding Civilisation. And at the moment, unfortunately, I'm the only survivor to school. So even though I was young at the time, but I'm no longer a young man. But we all share the legacy of promoting Civilisation ideology perpetually. So having said that, where do we go from there after 1991, after Civilisation passed away? Well, our foundation Hong Kong has taken a number of initiatives. We set up a chair professorship at Cambridge at the University of Hong Kong. And then we went on to set up the what we call a STEAM education series for high school students in Hong Kong. Because we realized that by dealing with professor, dealing with very established scholars, that's not enough. We have to do more. So we try to get the young students to know more about science, technology, education, and so forth. And we are doing it now since 2020. And we also have 2 fellowships. Unfortunately, the first one was 1993. Think about that, 1993 was the first fellowship. And then the next one was 2022. A young man now. So you can see that our funding is also pretty tough. And of course, the last one we had was the Joseph Needham Merit Scholarship. So just for clarity, the Joseph Needham Merit Scholarship is set up for people going on a PhD program. And for PhD program, 90% of them have financial support from the university, in addition to being very good scholars. But we believe Joseph Needham humanity, empathy toward people must be an ingredient for those scholars that we elected. So we do this, and we have done it very well since 2020. At the end of 2023, we now have 34 young, we hopefully future scholars. And we are going to meet an NRI in Cambridge in November. At this time, we was from UK and the European student. Now, just one more item before I go on to the next slide again. Beginning 2015, 2018, 2023, and 2024, we have set up a series of conferences. We believe we have talked a lot about science, but we also need to focus on civilization. And that is the reason why my colleagues, Arun Bala, or we should call him Bala, so Arun Bala, and I have worked very closely to set up the conference. Particularly last year, 2023, and we were talking a little. Now, when Joe passed away in 1995, to be precise, March 24, 25, depending on where he lived, in the UK or in Hong Kong. He was still working in his office 2 days before he died. So you can imagine people like me, like my friend Robert Yates, who is here and who was one of the XCC collaborators. We all look young, we are young in our hearts. So I just want to encourage our audience, that we may be getting white hair, gray hair, whatever. But think about how Needham survived. It was a passion. And I think that is the same in my heart that I had a passion. I've been involved since mid-70s, 1977, precise. First as scholar in his lab, and then secondly as an officer of the Hong Kong Trump. And I'm very happy the role has continued. So I'm looking for success who can help, but unfortunately, it's going to take a lot of persuasion to handle it. So if you visit Cambridge today, NRI, you see that the tree signifies eternity. But this is also a tree where the three bodies, ashes, will co-bury together. Needham, Dorothy Needham, and Luigi Needham. So it's a must for anybody who visits Cambridge to the NRI front. I just mentioned a while ago that in the late 2000s, we set up 2 professorships, and one Hong Kong U and one in Cambridge. And I see I have less than 1 minute. So I need to say thank you, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for that wonderful introduction to the background of the Joseph Needham Foundation. I think it's given us all an idea of how it began so many decades back, 70s to now. So I think we will now go on to the next speaker, who is coming on Zoom.
Stop sharing before. Exit. And press the exit. Yep, you're good.
The next speaker is Professor Gregory.
Dr. Blue, could share your screen?
Dr. Blue does not look like he is in the chat, in
Oh.
the Zoom.
Dr. Blue is not here, so
Is not here, so we'll go on to the next. Okay, just to give you a background, Professor Gregory Blue was going to talk on the assessing Needham's approach to international scientific and technical exchange. He's an emeritus professor of history and associate fellow of Global Studies Center at the University of Victoria in California. And when he comes on, if he comes on later, we'll put him on. So I will introduce the next speaker, who is Professor Robin Yates. He will be speaking on Western studies of warfare in China since Needham's Science and Civilization, a series with a focus on the history of gunpowder. And I must mention, he's the James McGill Professor of East Asian Studies and History and Classical Studies at McGill University.
Yes.
Yes. And you're editing a volume for Cambridge on military history.
That is
Sounds threatening. Okay.
Just to say.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Bala. Let me just correct one little thing. The University of Victoria is not in California, not in the United States, it's in Canada. It is in British Columbia, Victoria's capital, British
I
Columbia.
don't think I ever said it was in
Well, it's kind of-
the United States.
Yeah. Okay, so, I'm going to talk about, a sort of, really what I studied and worked with Joseph Needham. So, this is my title. I hope you can all hear me. I can't see the screen. In particular, I'm going to talk about gunpowder and what Joseph Needham wrote and published in 1986, the Gunpowder Epic. And the first thing to note is that he was collaborating, as Dr. Peter Lee has mentioned. He collaborated with, for many, many years with Uwe Jung and also with Dr. Herpen Yu or Herpen Yok, as well as Wang Li. So he really used a scientific approach to the study. And in particular, one of the things that really impressed me was that he brought in younger scholars, such as myself, well, as I was then. This was really quite unusual because most of the people really look at, from the humanities, only look at an individual. And what I would certainly want to encourage is the collaborative work between individuals who have different expertise. So this particular volume, the Gunpowder Epic, took 40 years to complete, and it continued the work of other scholars from the 1940s that had already challenged the idea that gunpowder had been invented in the West. So this is what the cover of the book looks like. And basically what Joseph was trying to find was the origins of Francis Bacon's idea concerning the inventions that had changed the world. And these inventions were the compass, gunpowder, the printing press. Those are the three that Bacon mentions, and of course also paper too. So Professor Tien of the University of Chicago collaborated with Needham and basically wrote that volume. So probably all of you know who Francis Bacon was. He was one of the main philosophers who began to develop the notion of the scientific method in the West. So this is what Bacon said, transcribed into modern English, needless to say, and he was followed by perhaps even more an individual by the name of Karl Marx, who also emphasized the importance of those inventions in the 19th century. So there were 3 projected volumes, and we decided together in 1979, 1980, and the first was published in 1986. And the second volume, which was really, preceded the Gunpowder Epic, was published in 1994. And I remember I worked like something like 4 years on on correcting that volume. And the third volume was never finished, nor was it published. And now that I am collaborating again, as Dr. Bala just mentioned, on the Cambridge History of War, Volume 1. Unfortunately, my co-editor passed away last September, so it's a bit of a problem. But I do have one other written in German. So gunpowder is a combination of saltpeter, sulfur, and carbon. And according to Joseph Needham's research, it was invented by Taoists, and he had a big thing about Taoism, who were experimenting with chemical composition. Of course, they didn't see them as chemicals. So it was initially used as a slow-burning match, and the Chinese increased the nitrate content until a true explosion. So Needham argues in his book that not only did the Chinese invent gunpowder, and the first written formula comes in the Wujing Zhongyao of 1044, but they invented guns and with long excursus on the rockets in his volume. So one of the leading scholars of science and technology reviewed that book, and he criticized Joseph by saying there was not enough on saltpeter, basically because saltpeter was invented, or was discovered, I should say, not invented, discovered as a salt by Westerners, and that knowledge was brought to China, then the Taoists made use of it. So what you see is a kind of circulation of knowledge going back and forth. And the first clear evidence for the refining of saltpeter is in the Tiangong Kaiwu, only in the 17th century. So basically, very little had been written about Chinese warfare up to the time that Needham wrote. And the reasons were, as I show on the screen, intellectual reasons, was not interest among scholars about that, about warfare, and emphasis was on Chinese philosophy and on the bureaucracy and the Mandarinate and basically the Confucian tradition. And there were also historical reasons, because China had been defeated and so on. So the focus of Chinese scholars themselves was really on reconstruction after maybe 100 years of war. So they weren't interested in the history of war in the West, in information about it, and they weren't interested in any comparison. So really, prior to Needham's work, very little had been published on the history of China's war. So I will just give you some examples. Frank Kiernan and John Fairbank being the Dean of China Studies at Harvard University, in a book called Chinese Ways in Warfare in 1974. But there had been really no monograph written on the topic. Probably the only person who really had written extensively was the late William H. McGill in The Pursuit of Power, which was then turned into the age of gunpowder and empires, 1450 to 1800. And he had a chapter, if you look at the book, on the era of Chinese predominance, 1000 to 1500. So I did a little bit of work with you. This is what the original title cover of the book looks like. So basically, in recent scholarship on the Chinese arts of war, there is a lot of work on Sun Tzu's Art of War, in many translations, in multiple languages. Looked at the Russian one, the French one, and The French one was very early in the 17th century. And 20th century warfare on warlordism, etc. The Great East Asian War, which is maybe most people don't know about, but the Koreans call it the Imjin War, 1592 to 1598. And then there's a lot of work done on the first emperor's mausoleum and the pottery warriors was discovered in 1975. Then with the 600th year of Zheng He's, the eunuch, Ming eunuchs, general, Ming eunuch admirals, voyages, there was a lot of work done there, now it's been done. And then with Mongols, the Sung Dynasty warfare, Middle Period warfare, and Chinese martial arts. So really, not very much has been done to pick up Needham's. So the characteristics of Needham's volume are first, a very detailed history of the invention of gunpowder and gunpowder weapons, and he based it on very careful reading of primary sources, and contained many difficult technical terms, which had never been attempted before. And of course, he made up words too, which had to try to explain to the Western reader what the Chinese, pre-modern Chinese ideas. And he analyzed and speculated on the transfer of gunpowder and technology to the West, and engaged in the circulation of its knowledge from China to the West and back again. This constant movement back and forth. And he included the prehistory of gunpowder and associated weapons. And of course, the first volume also talked about that too. And he tried to place them within that social, political, and military context, but probably the emphasis there is so there have been a series of recent Western books on the history of gunpowder and its transmission. Kenneth Chase's book on firearms and global history. Alfred Crosby, Tonio Andrade is probably the one person working most closely on this. And Philip Hoffman's and others collaborative work reviewing Andrade. So one of the things that is really important to note is that Chinese warfare was engaged in not just with the West and not just with the northern nomadic peoples, but also in Southeast Asia. I mentioned the Korean wars, but with Japan too, and that the Indian War was between Japan, Korea, and Ming China. So it's not just a matter of East and West. It's the development of warfare and special consequences in different parts of the world. And in the West, we have to deconstruct the West because warfare had very different consequences between Western Europe, Western Northern Europe, and Eastern Europe. Similarly, it's important to read the history of warfare in East Asia, not just China. So it's really important to see that. And that's one of the reasons why you need to have people who have different specializations. So in China, I would say that probably Needham's influence is more than in the West. So here are some examples of work that has been done recently by Chinese scholars. And the most recent is the one on the right above me, warming inside war. And here he's looking at, he has an entire chapter on biology. Thank you. So some quick concluding remarks. Needham's influence. It's first of all is the importance of reading, understanding, and translating primary sources, especially those of a technical nature, has a tendency not to do that. So, for example, there is no study and analysis of the major work in the early Ming dynasty by attributed to Liu Ji, who was one of the gunpowder experts, the first emperor of the Ming dynasty in the late 14th century. So there's nothing done on that yet. I don't think I remember it. I have 2 minutes. Yes. 2 minutes, okay. And first, and then there was the importance of engaging in the circulation of knowledge when studying the history of science and technology. Needham tended to emphasize Chinese priorities in the invention of particular technologies and sciences. And there is also the very important importance of studying material objects too, such as actual guns, and looking at them and studying them carefully. And there is also the importance of locating scientific and technological inventions within their own intellectual, social, and cultural traditions that Needham, I would say himself, wasn't really equipped, nor was there much scholarship being done at the time to take care of that. He focused more on the science and technology. So, do many Western scholars nowadays refer to Needham's magnum opus on gunpowder? Not as many as should, I would say. Do Chinese scholars? Yes, they do. But, and there are indeed many more than Western scholars. But we need both, I think. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Gregory is now here.
Okay, thank you, Robin, for that wonderful presentation of the circulation of gunpowder knowledge across the Eurasian region. And certainly I agree with you that scholarship shouldn't remain in those separate tunnels of Chinese historians working on what happened in China, and European scholars, working mostly on what happened in Europe, but trying to make small forays into, what happened in China in the past. There could be a lot more interchange between these different scholars working in different areas of the world. And that could include, I suppose, the Islamic and all the other countries. I noticed that there was also a foray into Southeast Asia, my part of the world, which I didn't know about. Okay, now next we have Professor Marta Hanson.
Gregory is now here.
Oh, yes. Okay. Sorry. Yes. Next, we have the speaker who was going to come on earlier, Professor Gregory, speaking on assessing Needham's approach to international scientific and technological exchange. He is the Emeritus Professor of History and Associate Fellow of the Global Studies Center at the University of Victoria, Canada. Okay, so, yes. Okay, and Professor Gregory Blue, I think you're on.
Thank you very much, Professor Bala. Joseph Needham's approaches to scientific internationalism is going to be at the heart of my talk today. Are you hearing me all right, Melanie?
Can everyone hear him?
Yes, we can hear you.
Kind of.
Yes. Okay. So Needham's approaches to scientific internationalism will be at the heart of my talk today. 2024, this year, marks the 80th anniversary of Needham's first two internationally circulated memoranda that proved key into putting the S for science into UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, formally established in 1946. This year also marks the 70th anniversary of the publication of the first volume that launched Needham's monumental Science and Civilization in China series, a venture that remains underway still today. and apologies to anyone who doesn't know that series, I'm going to refer to it as SCC, as we conventionally do in what follows for brevity. And apologies also to anyone who knows the series well, or covering materials you might already be acquainted with, or for omitting things you think I should include. The fact that we're now facing anniversaries of 70 and 80 years ago implies, among other things, that Needham's world and his worldview were different in many ways from those current today. And indeed, for some people, they're quite alienating. Yet, nevertheless, something of his intellectual power reveals itself in the fact, as Florence Shaw and Dagmar Schaffer put it in ISIS a few years ago, that his work still attracts and frustrates us in equal measure and continues to provoke. Joseph Needham was a notable figure in several ways. He was unusual in the first place in that he was not only a maker of scientific history, both as a biochemist and as an organizational visionary, but also as a historian of science whose writings had a major impact on the field, opening up a whole new continent to the history of science, as Tom Kuhn once put it, technically an exaggeration perhaps, but one that captured a great deal of truth. Needham was in addition a controversial figure through the various phases of his life, and indeed remained so even in death due to disputes over his legacies. Moreover, he was remarkable for the multifaceted intercultural bent he displayed, as evident in his religious and political commitments, as well as his scientific career from his teens onwards. Given the richness of his life and work, there are many ways one can approach his contributions. My aim today is to consider and think through how Needham's longstanding devotion to exploring the history of what he called scientific and technical transmissions and exchanges relates to his broader understandings of and commitments to scientific internationalism. Despite its somewhat in the weeds character, this is a topic with various implications for how SCC as a project continues to be perceived. My suggestion is that the notion of scientific internationalism that Needham and others on the international left came to embrace in the 1930s and 40s provided a conceptual medium that would color the multi-volume SCC project and would in particular animate his commitment to exploring cross-cultural exchanges, transmissions, appropriations, etc. Now, one must immediately observe that Needham's interpretation of scientific internationalism was a quite peculiar one. I will get to that in a moment, but first let me say that personally I find Kurt Sommelson's thoughts on early 20th century scientific nationalism and scientific internationalism quite helpful as laid out in his 2008 Minerva article. Sommelsson distinguishes, please excuse my simplifications, a blunt scientific nationalism which promotes scientific and technological development to increase the relative power of one's own state in competition with others, including prominently in the military realm. This he contrasts with a competitive form of scientific internationalism referred to sometimes as the Olympic model that validated a country's national scientific achievements by letting the results of national research be judged in comparison to a field of international competitors, again, with the aim of competitively enhancing one's national power. In contrast with each of these, Sommelsson argues, there emerged among leftist scientists during the interwar period, especially during the Depression, an approach that identified scientific progress as historically transcending national boundaries and that called for strengthening scientific development through international cooperation rather than competition as a way of bringing the benefits of such developments broadly to the people and as a way of building peaceful bridges between nations. Needham himself played a significant role in articulating this latter approach to scientific internationalism. For him, science was in principle an international activity, one to which different peoples had contributed and in which all peoples should have a right to share. The notion that different peoples had contributed to international science became, in the second half of Needham's career, a key pillar of the SCC project. But that's getting a bit ahead of myself. To understand the thrust of SCC's internationalist outlook and Needham's take on cross-cultural scientific communications, it's useful, I think, to briefly review how international experience ran through his own life and career. Born in 1900 and raised by an Irish mother and an English father of Gallophile tastes, Needham as a youth traveled repeatedly to France with his father, who also fostered in him a distinctly ecumenical approach to religion. Early in the 1920s, after finishing his Cambridge undergraduate studies in medicine and biochemistry, he worked for a year in a leading academic biochemical lab in Germany, where he confirmed his liking and propensity for experimental bench work and consolidated his German. After earning his PhD and being awarded a research fellowship in 1924 in Cambridge, when he also married Dorothy Moyle, another gifted biochemist, Needham proceeded to build a solid career within the Dunn Biochemical Laboratory. In 1928, he was appointed demonstrator in biochemistry, and in 1934, reader, following this departure of JBS Haldane to London. During those years, biochemistry as a new discipline was sometimes sniffed at by other older biologists who doubted that atoms and molecules could reveal anything significant about the nature of life. Needham's first magnum opus addressed that question, his 3-volume Chemical Embryology, which appeared in 1934. And through the later 1930s, he led a major Rockefeller-funded project on the chemistry of life, which resulted, among other things, in his massive volume Biochemistry and Morphogenesis, published in 1942, his having been elected a Fellow of the Royal Society the previous year. As a leading biochemist and public champion of the new discipline, Needham wound up in various kinds of contention in those years, but also found himself in considerable academic demand. As such, he traveled and spoke widely across Europe and in North America, from Poland to California, constantly expanding the wide network of contacts and friends that he and Dorothy had cultivated through research at marine biological labs in France and the US. Through the 1930s, Needham was also prominently in the public eye in Britain, both as a socialist public intellectual, arguing for increased funding for scientific research for popular benefit, but also as a strong voice opposing fascism, Nazism, and Francoism. The excellent research of Patrick Petitjean and Gary Werski throws much light on this phase of his career. In Berlin, during 1933-1934, Needham personally witnessed the devastation being worked on Germany's scientific community and scientific labs by the Nazi regime, which he vigorously denounced and worked against at home. 3 years later, he similarly conspicuously became involved in supporting the Spanish Republic. His internationalism then took a new turn from 1936-37, when a set of brilliant Chinese students arrived in Cambridge to do doctoral research. One of these, Wang Yinglai, would in 1955 become one of the founders of the People's Republic of China's new Academy of Sciences. Another of those students was Lu Guizhen, who managed to escape Shanghai Harbor as the Japanese Navy undertook its bombardment in the summer of 1937, and who was drawn specifically to Cambridge to study by the thought that Needham could lend China a similar kind of international political support against Japanese occupation that he had already provided to anti-fascists in Spain. And he did so. The two of them soon developed an intimate relationship, and he began immersing himself in Chinese culture. About the time Lu left Cambridge in 1939 to serve as a Chinese delegate at the Sixth Pacific Science Conference in San Francisco, Needham also encountered Lo Zhongshu on leave as Dean of Liberal Arts at West China Union University in Chengdu, who, while upgrading his qualifications at Oxford, made many contacts in Britain and advanced a strong case for increased British support for China's wartime universities, including through sending people to China who had scientific expertise. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, Needham was co-opted to the Biology War Committee, and in 1940 was sent to the United States on a speaking tour aimed at mobilizing US scientific opinion in favor of the British war effort. In that capacity, he gave his address, The Nazi Assault on International Science, to audiences across the country. In it, he identified 4 traits as characteristic of the Nazi fascist movement in terms of impacting science, namely anti-intellectualism, racism, the militarization of science, and the Führerprinzip, that is the belief in the infallibility of the leader. Thank goodness we don't see any of that anymore. He also called attention to the plight of the then nearly 1,900 scientists who had had to flee Germany and who were in need of international support. In 1942, after Pearl Harbor and the outbreak of the Pacific War, Needham again hit the road, this time sent to China by the British Council to give moral support to Chinese scientists, many of whom had been displaced with their universities to Western China, which was free of Japanese occupation. Seeing the direness of their needs, he listened to their take on their country's plight and its needs. He then returned the following year with approval from the Royal Society and the Foreign Office, and established the Sino-British Scientific Cooperation Office, the SBSCO, a joint governmental institution supported by the UK Ministry of Production and the Chinese Ministry of Defense, which he headed. He headed the Cooperation Office until returning to Britain in 1946, 4 years later. That body, as he headed it, was conceived as a counterpart to similar British offices in Washington, D.C. and Moscow, linking the greatest allies. But of course, many Chinese needs in the scientific realm were situation specific. The Sino-British Scientific Cooperation Office carried out a variety of exchange functions, including bringing in scientific literature and equipment from the Western allies, sending out research studies by Chinese scientists, providing expert advice on the state of research abroad and how Chinese science might be enhanced. At the same time, Needham made a series of tours to Chinese scientific institutions throughout much of Free China, which allowed him to canvass opinions on the country's needs very broadly. On the basis of those tours, he published a series of reports on the state of Chinese science in Nature. It was on the basis of his experience in China that he developed his proposal that the Allies after the war should establish an international body charged with doing similar work to build up scientific and industrial capacities throughout the world's non-industrialized regions, which he called the dark zone, because of the weakness there of scientific establishments. It's notable that Needham's later persistent vision of science as covering both pure and applied realms, which can be problematic in historiography, was tied then to his policy view that building scientific capacity in the global South should include engineering dimensions that would facilitate industrialization. Needham first advocated the idea of a new international scientific cooperation organization in December 1943, in a letter to the Chinese Foreign Ministry TV Song, the brother of the Chinese First Lady. And he reiterated the idea again in his report on the first year of the Sino-British Scientific Cooperation Office's operations. He put forward the idea to a broader international audience of politicians, scientists, and journalism in his 3 privately circulated memoranda dating from July 1944, December that year, and April 1945. The third, composed partly during trips to Washington and Chicago and completed in Chongqing, argued that the new scientific organization should be integrated as an equal department with education and culture in the body that the Allied Ministers of Education had just approved with the acronym UNESCO, UNECO. For the processes by which science was incorporated into UNESCO, and UNESCO gained its S as a co-equal department, the processes by which Julian Huxley was appointed as UNESCO's first Director General, and Needham was appointed the founding director of the science department, as well as for their respective initiatives and fates there, one can consult the excellent work of Patrick Petitjean, John and Richard Toy, and Thomas Muhi. Suffice it to say here that the new intergovernment organization did establish a co-equal science department in 1949 with the support of organized American scientists and the new British Labour government. Needham accepted the appointment as science director and remained in the post for 2 years before the chill of the Cold War led him to step down. In the meantime, he succeeded in putting into effect a number of major proposals from his third memorandum, including support for the international scientific unions and conferences, a grant and aid system for scientific research, the establishment of scientific field offices located in non-industrial countries and regions, and meant to help build up scientific and technical resources there, as his own SBSCO had done in Chongqing. One key proposal that was initially adopted from Memo 3, but then backed away from once Needham left UNESCO, was what he termed the periphery principle, a notion that seems to have arisen from generalizing from discussions with colleagues in China, as well as from ideas of the 30s British left. This principle held that the new science organization should give priority to building up scientific and technical capacities for the benefits of the people in the non-industrial regions via the sharing of knowledge and expertise from the scientifically advanced, or what he called bright zone countries. As Patrick Petitjean has noted, this approach was allowed to lapse in the 50s, but experienced a return after decolonization. Needham's long insistence that the science policy needed to take history into account led Huxley to charge him, along with Lucien Faber, with devising the initial sketch for the scientific and cultural history of mankind, which UNESCO was then sponsoring. Needham brought all this international experience with him when he returned to Cambridge in 1948. There he took up duties in the biochemistry department again. It would occupy him until his retirement from teaching in 1966. However, as a researcher, his art was with the historical project that he had in mind for the past dozen years. The first volume of Science and Civilization in China appeared in 1954, the second introductory volume in 56. By 1959, with the publication of the third volume devoted to mathematics, astronomy, and the earth sciences, the series was being proclaimed a monument of scholarship. In the light of its contribution to scholarship, Needham in 1971 would be elected president of the International Union of the History of Science, as well as being inducted into the British Academy. Let me now turn briefly to the SCC project a little more. From the outset, this was designed within an international intellectual framework as an internationalist contribution to scholarship. World historians in recent decades have identified two major approaches to their subject. One focused on comparison between societies, civilizations, and other units of analysis. The other focused on communication and exchange between them. Science and Civilization in China incorporated both of those approaches, and in that sense constituted an innovative original contribution to world history, as well as to the historiography of science. As already observed, there are many angles from which one can examine and assess this project. One can argue, for example, that the project stands and remains useful as a scholarly monument, even if one ignores the so-called Needham problem, which for Needham was an essential heuristic tool. The problem being, why was it that modern science only emerged in the West and not in China, despite China's long lead in and prominence in scientific and technical innovation for the 1500 years before the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Frankly, my own experience with Needham was that while he uniformly referred to the problem when discussing the SCC project as a whole, he rarely, if ever, thought about it in consideration with discussing concrete scientific, technical, and medical practices. In terms of the SCC project, however, the stress on exchanges and transmissions was arguably even more integral to the overall Needham project from the start. That it was baked in from the outset is evidenced by the fact that 40% of volume 1 of the series was devoted to aspects of transmission. And I suggest that the stress Needham placed upon it, like his insistence on keeping pure and applied realms under the same science rubric, derived to a considerable extent from his earlier commitment to promoting scientific and technical change as a way to build capacities and raise living standards in the global South. To wind up, this talk simply suggests a convergence between an internationally lived life in science and a historiography sensitive to the international dimensions of science, particularly in regard to transmissions and exchanges. What I have not done and tried to address is the overwhelming direction of scientific transmission that Needham posited from west to east in the 1500 years before the Renaissance. To do that, to address that question, would take a detailed case-by-case study equal to the case-by-case studies that Needham himself undertook when demonstrating the prominence and achievements of the scientific and technical traditions of China in the imperial era prior to the early modern period. With that, I will close. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Gregory Blue, for that excellent introduction to Needham's biography and his efforts to promote international exchanges across various civilizations. And although his work focused only on China, it is clear from your talk that the implications of his work and what he had said over many years about how we should go forward fits in with this conference, on circulation of knowledge and the kind of vision that we have. Now, thank you. Thank you. Now, next, we have Professor Marta Hanson. She is the professor of East Asian medicine in Johns Hopkins University, formerly, And she will be talking on penetrating questions and living exchange, Joseph Needham and Nathan Sivin on using comparison in history of science. Professor Hanson.
Yes, hi. Hello, everybody. I do need to share my screen so I can share my slides.
You should be able to directly on your end.
Right. Host disabled precipitant screen sharing for me.
I can do that right now. Hold on.
Sorry. So I'll just start out with, I want to thank Peter Lee and Arun Bala for inviting me to participate on this panel on Needham's legacy. As Gregory just referred to, we are in a period of taking a second look at Needham's legacy, and you referred to the special section, a second look in ISIS of 2019, that Florence Cohen, the editor of ISIS, had I should be able to screen, and so I think I'm also inspired by that, taking a second look. Am I able to share now? Ah, good. And so now where are my slides? Okay. There we are. I think I need to put, I'm coming. I'm unmuted, right?
Yes.
Okay, and now we're going to the slideshow. Play from the start. Okay, before I go,
We
yes,
do not see your screen yet.
what?
Can you make sure that you pressed share the green button on Zoom?
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just going to have to shoot. This is okay. I'm sorry for the delay here a little bit, but it's coming. Okay. I'm coming. Just wait. Share. Now,
Yeah, perfect. Right.
you see my slideshow?
We see your home screen, and now we see your slideshow with speaker notes.
Okay,
So what you're going to want to do is go out of that first. Yep, okay. Control or Alt Tab into it. When you share your screen.
yeah.
How to do this. Yeah, how to Control Alt. I don't know how. Okay, so you're sharing your screen. You share your screen, just do what you did before.
I think I can do. I think it's going to be okay. I think I just share a different thing, and I think it's going to be okay. Just let me. I have now. Do you have just my talk and not
That's
me?
perfect. Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Okay. So I want to point out to everybody in this. Okay, so this is actually a fictive lunch that happened, and but it's based on a photograph that happened over dinner in 1982. We see Joseph Needham to the left. We see Nathan Sivin on the right, Lu Guizhen going clockwise, Panji Xing, and Francesca Bray, and Kenneth Robinson, and then on the right side there to Nathan Sivin's right is Gregory Blue, who just preceded me. He worked on, he really helped me this summer to solve the mystery of this sketch that was, and also John Moffat, who I will come to shortly. And what I wanted to say is that Jeffrey did rightly gesture to this really extraordinary second look at Needham and ISIS. I recommend everybody look at it. And I think it's even worth revisiting the editor, Flores Cohen's, not just his editor's introduction, but his book on the scientific revolution, a historiographic inquiry, which has a whole really, I think, the best review of the Needham question, useful for revisiting, but also teaching and maybe using for one's lectures. I really want to express gratitude for this invitation as well, for introducing me to this intellectual group. Bringing me into the fold of the Circulating Knowledge Conference. I'm very much invested in, quote, reconceptualizing the global origin and worldwide circulation of knowledge of the natural world, unquote, from your for your vision of this conference. I have a long-term collaboration with early modern historian of science, Jana Pomada. It's a grounded global microhistory of the first translation into Latin of Chinese medicine, a whole range of things. We call it a sample, Specimen Medicinae Sinicae, which was published in Frankfurt in 1682. But the purpose for this panel, I've been given the opportunity to do new research, and that's on the intellectual exchanges between Joseph Needham and Nathan Sivin on using comparison in the history of science. I am very much inspired by Elise Burton's fascinating plenary yesterday on rethinking forms and scales of scientific collaboration based on her research on the Pasteur Institute in Iraq in the mid-20th century, because she concluded her talk acknowledging her research assistant, Tomohisa Sumida, for analysis of the Japanese materials that were central to that study. Here, I want to start my talk by acknowledging my deep debt to John Muffett at the Needham Research Institute. He has sent me all the correspondence between Joseph Needham and Nathan Sivin, which started in 1959, the second year that Nathan was in graduate school at Harvard History of Science Department. I have not been able to go through this archive for this talk, but I just want to gesture that that is a major source, and all of this material actually will be copied and included in an archive that I was a part of establishing that exists now at the University of Pennsylvania. It has 46 boxes. I don't need to go through 20 of which are Nathan's correspondence from 76 on. So as you can see, the material from the Needham Research Archive is really important to add to this archive, because we don't have anything from 76 from his years at Harvard or MIT. And the other 26 boxes are of Carol Sivin's journals and research files and teaching material, and many, many photographs that are of interest for historians of the development of the history of science and sinology in the second half of the 20th century. But what inspired me for this talk, returning to the subject title of this talk, Penetrating Questions and Lively Exchange, was inspired by the foreword that Joseph Needham wrote for the first two Festschrift issues in honor of Nathan Sivin of Chinese Science. This was in 1995, the year that he passed. Nathan, over 20 years earlier, had, quote, wrote from MIT to ask some penetrating questions about the Science and Civilization in China project. In fact, we now know from the NRI archive that this engagement began in 1959. Furthermore, Needham wrote, from this lively exchange grew a relationship that has made him a frequent visitor to our group at Cambridge, both as a collaborator and as a friend. I came across this source when I was co-authoring with Asaf Goldschmidt and Michael Nylon what became a tribute to Nathan Sivin that is just published a month ago in the journal that he established, East Asian Science, Technology, and Medicine. It was originally Chinese science, which he had established in 1975 when he was at MIT nearly 50 years ago now. Needham continued to sketch the contour of his work with Nathan in the same foreword. Nathan, quote, twice worked with us as a collaborator, making a direct contribution to SCC. Thank you, Gregory, for using that acronym. These collaborations were the, quote, substantial contribution to Volume 5, Part 4 on the theoretical background of elixir alchemy, in Needham's view, and also in the summer of 1994 when he visited Cambridge to edit the materials on medicine that Lu Guizhen and I had prepared for SEC, unquote. Their exchanges spanned 35 years, from 59 to 1995, when Needham passed away. We see here first a photo on your left of him with Carol and Nathan, Carol wearing one of her signature life masks. And then the one on the right is a picture at a different time of Joseph with Nathan, with what I think is one of the only known masks that Carol had made of Nathan. And you can see here a very warm, collegial, even playful relationship between the two great historians of science in China. Their exchange, there is an extraordinary sketch the Chinese historian of science Pan Ji-xing published in a Chinese translation of 40 years worth of Needham's collective writings on China, covering 1944 to 1984. This sketch depicts the deeply collaborative nature of the entire SEC enterprise that Needham inspired and that Nathan clearly relished, and that Gregory just also, I think all my panelists have made clear, and Gregory explicitly talked about, and actually both he and of course Robin were collaborators. So we see Needham, just to unpack the sketch a little, he sits in the center of the picture holding a traditional Chinese thread-bound book. He looks to his right toward Dorothy Mary Morrill Needham, an accomplished biochemist in her own right, surrounded by the trappings of modern chemistry, test tubes, flasks, and beakers. First, in a clockwise direction from Dorothy Needham, is Kenneth Girdwood Robinson, an expert in Chinese music theory, holding an early divination board. The high noon position features an astronomical tower, constellations, and symbols of the sun and moon. At 2 o'clock, Chen, the Chinese-American sinologist, bibliographer, and scholar of, Chen Sun-shun, scholar of Chinese paper and print technology, holds a Chinese wood printing block. Just in front of Chen sits Lu Guizhen, reading a fascicle of the famous Bensao Mu, or Systematic Materia Medica, with some more Chinese-style books and a plant sample on her desk. Below her, between 4 and 5 o'clock, stands Needham's chief researcher and first collaborator, the history of early Chinese mathematics, historian of early Chinese mathematics, Wang Ling, touching a bronze celestial sphere with more Chinese books under his left arm. At 6 o'clock sits Nathan himself, holding a medicine gourd in his right hand and an alchemical flask in his left. And to his right sits his Singaporean mentor, Hu Peng-yok, who's already been mentioned by my esteemed panelists, who taught him Chinese alchemy while Nathan was writing his PhD thesis. He visited Singapore from August 1962 to March 1963. Professor He holds Chinese arrows loaded with gunpowder, the theme that Robin just discussed in his earlier presentation. The porcelain container to his right is filled with more of these arrows, and an illustrated book lies open in front of him, ready for He to consult its instructions. This very lively sketch neatly captures the main intellectual interests of what the image's captions summarize, namely the principal people writing the new 5 volumes of Joseph Needham's Science and Civilization in China. Other scholars, according to Needham's, the first publication to result from the initial lively exchange Needham mentioned in his relationship with Nathan in his foreword was published in 1980. This is volume 5, part 4, and it's section 5, the theoretical background of Lexer alchemy that Nathan contributed. This volume is the first in any SEC series, in fact, where Needham acknowledged any co-authorship in a different way, in this case, simply with Nathan Sivin. He then also introduces Nathan as a new collaborator, very specifically. Also, what's very interesting in these published texts is how he talks about the difference between his previous collaborators and how he distinguishes his work with Nathan from them. So they provided research assistance, special cooperation, but he assumed, that is, Needham, full responsibility for their collective collusions, as seen at the end of the second highlighted passage. quote, all incoherences and contradictions which remain after our long discussion must be laid at my door, in answer to which I can only say that the state of art is as yet far imperfect, that it will certainly be improved by later scholars, and in the meantime, we have done the best we can. I like that. Just a few sentences later, the third highlighted passage, Needham explained why he chose to acknowledge Nathan's contributions differently, revealing his accepting attitude toward interpretive differences with Nathan. And then you see why he wrote with Nathan. I don't think I need to read this quote. And in the following paragraph, we see, let's see. I got this right? Okay. We see that Nathan makes a methodological point. Scholars must understand how Chinese apply their own notions of Chinese natural, okay, sorry. So okay, that's it. So now I go to the next thing. So in Nathan's first sentence of this section H on theoretical elixir alchemy, which is markedly, markedly different from the other contributions, because you see in the table of contents, it's with Nathan Sivin. It's a different relationship that Needham is marking here with Nathan. He says, our focus now shifts from the Chinese alchemists' identifiable photochemical accomplishments to the assumptions and concepts with which they themselves sought to explain their methods and aims. This shift in point of view is perhaps more radical than might at first appear. If we wish to understand the inner coherence of alchemical theories, we must for the moment set aside the yardstick of modern chemistry, although it will still be essential as an explanatory tool, and try to reconstruct the alchemist's abiding goals, his own standards of success and failure, as clues to how his concepts determine both what he did in his laboratory and how he rationalized unforeseen results. So he's making a methodological point. That the scholars must first understand in this time that what it is that the alchemists did, thought, and knew about on their own term and in their own context. So this is I don't know, I think I'm going to run out of time if I read everything that he writes, but he says it's just not acceptable to pluck the advanced elements out of the matrix and discard the retrograde aspects. It's a procedure bound to lead to fundamental distortions, for the two regularly turn out to be integral and inseparable, one element defining the range of possibilities for the other. So this is a very clear statement on the comparative method of evaluating past sciences with the present state of science that infused the SCC project. In fact, Nathan had already stated his different approach and accomplished most of these interpretive goals in his 1976 ISIS article that later was published in his edited book, Science and Technology in East Asia, of all the articles in ISIS up to that point that had been published about science in East Asia. His own opening questions and initial answers give a fair indication of what would have been the tenor of those first penetrating questions about the Science and Civilization in China project that Needham recollected about 2 decades later. So the image to the left here represents exactly what Nathan meant by the final sentence. The caption reads that the image portrays the Chinese version of the alchemical great work as an array of correspondences. The adept in the center is surrounded by correlates of yin and yang, the 5 phases, and the 8 trigrams of the Book of Changes. And so the argument is that these alchemical experiments didn't have chemical goals, but rather the ends were spiritual and transcendent. So the alchemist's enterprise, as they themselves defined it, was in fact not chemistry. That's his final point. So Sivin succinctly summed up his final assessment in the concluding sentence of this article. Quote, in China, the operative alchemy of the laboratory, no less than the physiological and introspective disciplines that borrowed its language and symbols, was a form of self-cultivation, a means toward transcendence. And he appropriately leaves the reader to ponder how the alchemical and transcendent come together in a poem. How many articles do you know end in poetry like that in the history of science? So in a letter that Needham wrote about one of Nathan's many reviews of the SCC volumes, with Nathan copied on the letter, he summed up his open attitude toward their well-known differences in how to approach the history of science in China. Quote, all in all, the review doesn't need any changing, and so far as we can see is a perfectly fair comment. Nathan and I never see eye to eye on all points, but think how dull life would be if we did. And that is, I found in the Sivin archives at the University of Pennsylvania. Excuse me. So Needham's designation of Nathan as a contributor in recognition of his provision of the subsection on the theoretical background of elixir alchemy was the first for the SCC project, but it was certainly not the last, and it set a precedent for later SCC volumes. Now, the second of the collaborations Needham mentioned in his 1995 foreword, Nathan had just started to work on in 1994 in Cambridge. Nathan mostly added explanatory footnotes and updated the bibliographies of 5 essays that Needham had mostly co-authored with his long-term collaborator, Lu Guizhen, which Peter opened up our panel introducing very eloquently, I think. Sivin also wrote an introduction that acknowledged their underlying positivism, summarized new historicizing methods, and called for further contextualized study of Chinese medical knowledge and practices within their historical milieus. Sivin praises their contributions to histories of medicine for both surprising Western scholars on the sophisticated and cumulative character of the Chinese tradition, and desiring to see the evolution of medicine as a social enterprise, rather than as a succession of breakthroughs by individual geniuses. He then clearly states his non-teleological, non-presentist viewpoint of the history of science as, quote, not a procession of destined triumphs, but a meandering journey, its direction often changing with no end, but where it turns out to be on any given day, unquote. Indeed, as he concludes, quote, the issue is not how A or B anticipated the modern Z, but how people went from A to B and what we can learn from that about the process of historical change. So by way of conclusion, it's important to recognize that Needham was well aware of and even welcomed Sivin's different approaches to comparative history. In the same author's introduction to the SEC Volume 5, Port 4 on chemistry and chemical technology, for which Nathan was singled out as a contributor, that is with Nathan Sivin, Needham quoted Sivin on what a, quote, a fruitful comparative history of science, unquote, should be founded on. Not on the counting of isolated discoveries, insights, or skills meaningful for us now, but upon the confrontation of integral complex ideas with their interrelations and articulations intact. These complexes could be kept in one piece only if the problems which they were meant to solve were understood. Chinese science must, in other words, be seen as developing out of one state of theoretical understanding into another, rather than as any kind of abortive development towards modern science. So this is Needham's own, assimilation of Sivin's critique, which he includes in his author's notes.
Hello, Professor Hanson.
Yes, are we done?
We are trying to connect up with you to say your time has exceeded by quite a few minutes, but
okay. All right.
just wind it up now because we have a timeline against which we are working.
Yeah,
so
sure. I will. I will wrap up. So then I did have things about how you can see a different approach to the comparative method on the Scientific Revolution article. But what I wanted to make is there's a shared humility that they both have about how whatever they say will be changed by others in the Needham's case, and in Sivin's case by himself a decade later. That there are certain ways of doing productive comparisons. which he carried out with Jeffrey Lloyd in The Way and the Word in 2002, and again in his own book, 2008, Granting the Seasons. And in an article of 2018, which I recommend all of you to read, where he returns to what the method, the cultural manifold method framework that you consider all pertinent dimensions of a complex phenomenon. And and then you can start to even think about and do the kind of comparison that Jeffrey Lloyd and Nathan Sivin did together. I want to end by saying that when I was wrapping up this talk, I really want to acknowledge my colleague Fatih Fan, because I think many of his criticisms and ways that of post-colonialism and approaches that he's trying to encourage are manifested in this kind of in the work that Nathan and Jeffrey Lloyd have done together. But I want to come back to the conversations at the table, and this image that I started the talk with, it was actually based on this photograph. And I really hope that all of you who can be there in person have the same kind of experience of penetrating questions and lively discussion that clearly Joseph Needham and Nathan Sivin had together.
Yeah, thank you, Marta.
Well, thank you. All right, I'll turn off my audio now.
On the collaborative designs of Needham and Sivin, which should be have a lot of insights to offer for what we are trying to do here. Now, the next speaker is Professor Bala. He is formerly Professor of Sociology in Hong Kong Metropolitan University, then has a forthcoming book critiquing both Eurocentrism and dialogism, which I look forward to reading. He will speak on a non-Eurocentric approach to the Needham Question, transcending dialogism. And I think there should be that's right, transcending dialogism. Professor Bala.
Okay. Now, the title of my talk is the Needham Question towards a non-Eurocentric approach, transcending the dialogical approach. Okay. So firstly, let me give you the background to the issue. Now, I'm only dealing with one aspect of the Needham question, namely why has subsoil science arisen in Latin Europe? Okay. And before Needham, and even after him, the predominant position is what we call the Eurocentric position. That is to say, it is argued, okay, that it is due to certain unique, quote unquote, European qualities, either in terms of Europeans as a people, as Europeans, okay, or in terms of European society, which is a kind of essentialism I call social essentialism, or due to certain qualities in the culture of Europe, which I call cultural essentialism. Okay, that's the Eurocentric position. Now, the importance of Needham is that his work inspired an opposing camp, what has been called the dialogical perspective. And one of the leading advocates of this perspective is, of course, Arun here. Now, what this camp argues is that Europe has learned a lot, has borrowed a lot from non-European civilizations, meaning Arabic science, Indian mathematics, and to a lesser extent, various ideas, scientific ideas from China. Okay, it is on the basis of these borrowings that Latin Europe was able to break through into modern science. Okay. Now, in response to the challenge of the dialogical perspective, Eurocentric scholars responded in various ways. One way was is what we call, or what I call, following the critic of Eurocentrism, John Hobson of Leeds University. the proposal of neo-Eurocentric arguments. That is to say, neo-Eurocentric arguments are usually in the form of cultural arguments, okay? That is to say, it is argued that certain so-called unique cultural qualities of Europe were responsible for making the breakthrough, although it is acknowledged that Europe had followed a lot from other civilizations, okay? Now, in response to neo-Eurocentric arguments, the dialogical perspective has not been able to respond. And in my own dialogue with Bala, I asked him, because I was actually new to the Needham Question myself. So I asked him, why and how was it possible for Europe, on the basis of what it had learned from other civilizations, to break through with modern science? And Bala answered me with this: it remains a black box. Okay, that is to say, within the parameters of the dialogical perspective, that perspective is unable to explain the breakthrough itself. Okay, and my forthcoming book is on this particular issue. It is to offer an argument of explaining that breakthrough itself on the basis of the dialogical perspective, or rather going beyond the dialogical perspective. Okay, now here we want the formulation of a particular theoretical methodological framework. Now this framework is a synthesis of various elements from various disciplines, of some of my own observations, and here is a list of the various elements. Firstly, second, dependence of historical development on the starting point. This inspiration comes from chaos theory in physics. Contingency in history as a systematically analyzable explanatory variable. Now, the recognition that contingency in history is so pervasive that this inspiration comes from three sources. One, it comes from the neo-Darwinist Harvard paleontologist Sivin. The second source of inspiration comes from path-dependent theory. The third source comes from the historian Kenneth Thomas, who's written a great book called Great Divergence. I talked to one of you somewhere about this great book. It's such an inspiration, the Great Divergence. Okay, anyway, the argument here is contingency. It's not just an accidental intervening variable in history. The very basic process of historical development is contingent in nature. See the synthesis of externalist and internalist explanations. That is to say, now in the literature, arguments are divided into either external arguments, externalist arguments, or internalist arguments. Externalist arguments such as social explanation considers the impact of social factors, of external factors, whereas internalist arguments consider factors internal to intellectual development itself, such as the sources of intellectual input, okay? And in my framework, I think it is necessary to synthesize the two kinds of explanations into a single one. E, solid tradition as a self-reinforcing informal institution that can be made subject to non-centrist analysis. Now, a solid tradition is a tricky issue. Now, this is my own observation. It's a very tricky issue. Scholars from the dialogical perspective are reluctant to consider solid tradition because they believe that solid tradition can only be accounted for on an essentialist basis. Europe had its own particular tradition because of certain qualities of European scholars, okay? That is wrong. That is wrong. And I would, well, I may not be able to illustrate this in full, but my argument is that scholarly tradition can be accounted completely on a non-essentialist basis. And then the distinction between and relation to the form aspect and substantive knowledge of scholarly tradition. This is the detail I will go into here. Historical development is path-dependent process. Now, PD theory comes from institutional economics and institutional sociology. Okay. One of its main arguments that history develops as a contingent process in a path-dependent way. Okay. And then process approach versus mechanistic approach. What I call mechanistic approach. Now, mechanistic approach is typical of eccentric arguments. For example, it argues with regards to Greece that it was the presence of Agora debate that directly produced the search for proof in mathematics. Now, this causal effect is conceptualized in terms of like billiard balls hitting one another in a direct mechanical way. Okay, I call it the mechanistic approach. Whereas process approach sees the historical outcomes as the final product of a long historical process. During this process, a lot of variables appear. These variables may not directly lead to the final outcome, but without the effect of these variables appearing at different stages of process, the direct outcome won't appear. Okay. I'm going to illustrate this later on. And then another factor that scholars of the dialogical perspective refuse to consider is the internal, what I call scholarly agency. Okay. Agency refers to the active role played by social agents. Now here I specify the values, rights, and so forth held by scholars. Again, once you talk about values, rights, people will immediately believe that this is a cultural essential argument. I'm going to show that it is wrong. Okay, values and rights of scholars can be explained wholly on a non-essential basis. Okay, now I'm not going to be able to go into details, but I'm going to illustrate examples. Okay, I'll go straight directly to the point. Why was Latin Europe able to make a breakthrough on the basis of what we did and learned? Okay, we begin with a contingent event, contingent in relation to intellectual development. And this is the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, a wholly contingent event. As a result of this, and the Ottoman Empire's further move to the west, there were two consequences relevant to our consideration. The first is that it led to the fleeing of Byzantine Greek scholars to Latin Europe. Brandon of them works on Neoplatonism, atomism, Hermeticism, and so forth. Now, in Latin Europe previously, Aristotle was completely dominant. Okay, the authority was unchallenged. Now, this consequence of this contingent event led to the availability of certain challenges to Aristotle that became available to Latin European scholars. Now, this is an internal factor. The sources available is an internal factor. A contingent external factor leads to changes in the internal factor between scholars. Okay, this is the first consequence. The second consequence is even more dramatic. Now, Europe, since antiquity, Europe had a great demand for spices formation. Okay, and it had always obtained spices through Arab merchants. Okay, now the conquest of Constantinople really shocked Europe. Okay, and as a result of which Europe decided that it would have to bypass the Arab merchants and go directly to the sources of spices. To bypass Arabs by force if necessary. Okay, now this is what led to the so-called voyages of discovery. Now, just a couple of words on this particular narrative, the voyages of discovery. Now, these voyages are not voyages of discovery at all. Nothing was to be discovered. The routes round the Cape of Good Hope had been traveled by Arab mariners previously. Okay, it was known to Europe. Okay. The government himself was able to cross the Indian Ocean with the help of an Arab mariner. He didn't discover how to do it himself. Okay. That Asia was the source of Cyprus, was known to Europe. Okay, nothing has been discovered. The only discovery was the transatlantic process, and this was, as well known, made by accident, not an intentional discovery. Okay. Now, the government, Columbus, and these people were adventurous, okay, but they were not curious discoverers. They were adventurous trying to make a kill for profit. And it was supported by investors, private investors as well as sovereigns, and blessed by the poor, because rather trade from Arab merchants was considered to be, because the Arab merchants were the hated enemy of Christianity. Okay, so much for the local voyages of discovery. Okay, now this led to the most dramatic consequence. Was that Spanish and Portuguese travelers going on these voyages made a lot of observations that flatly contradicted what the Greeks said about the world, the rest of the world. Okay. Now, Aristotle, Ptolemy, and so forth, they drew a lot of conclusions about the rest of the world purely by theoretical deduction. Okay, but these observations flatly contradicted them. And as a result, during the 16th century, increasing numbers of European intellectuals began to privilege empirical observation over pure theory. Now, this is what I refer to as an empirical term. Now, in addition to the empirical term, there's an associate term that I call the practical term. That is the belief that only knowledge that is empirically sustainable, that is practically useful, constitutes real knowledge. And I call this term a practical empirical term. Now, this involves scholarly agency, right? Okay. Increasing number of European intellectuals. Now, the value changed. Previously, they privileged pure theory. Now, they privilege empiricism, okay? And practical application, okay? And other result of that effect, because these observations flatly contradicted what Aristotle, Ptolemy, and the others concluded on pure theory. Okay, that went further to undermine the authority of Aristotle. Okay, another event again. Now, so again, you see that there is a contingent event, 1423, leading to a consequence, the so-called voyages of discovery. And this led to a further totally unforeseen, because it is unforeseen, it is also contingent consequence, namely the rise of the practical, what I call the practical empirical term. Now, this involves the internal agency of scholars, right? An external factor leading to changes in the internal agency of scholars. Okay. I just mentioned my final point. In 1517, we all know that Martin Luther published the 95 Theses, okay, Christianity stood right down the middle, okay. Now, this is an internal European factor, but it cannot be called an essence of Europe, because religious schisms happen everywhere. So it's not an essence of Europe. Now, what is the consequence of this particular event? Again, from the point of view of intellectual development, entirely contingent. It serves further to undermine, or rather, it serves to make scholars increasingly willing to break the orthodoxy. Break the orthodoxy of Aristotle, break the orthodoxy of Greek theory, and so on and so forth. So during the time I've only been able, I was to illustrate how the practical empirical term, how to the willingness to break orthodoxy was responsible for the breakthrough in the modern science with reference to Kepler, with reference to Galileo, but, I'm sorry, time's up. So, thank you.
Okay, well, we were planning to have 20 minutes for discussion with the different speakers, but that's not possible for various contingent reasons. But yeah, but I've been tasked with the job of somehow summarizing the various features which I won't even attempt to do. I think it's quite impossible for me to do that. But I would like to say something in general, by way of a conclusion as moderator. I think all the talks brought together the significance of this multi-civilizational exchange, or what you might call it, dialogical circulation of knowledge, global science studies, entanglements, but the idea of cross flows across civilizations, shaping science, not just modern science, because other speakers went back into the past too, but also current science. And so Peter Lee, Dr. Peter Lee, talked about, the Joseph Needham Foundation and the Needham Research Institute, and how, he developed and how he came to an endpoint of nurturing this kind of dialogical perspective implicit in Needham's views. Professor Gregory Blue talked about transmission and exchange issues and efforts to promote institutional collaboration as being something as being significant. And we had Professor Marta Hanson, and Marta talked about the collaborative enterprise of Needham and Sivin, which could be exemplary for other kinds of collaborations going forward. And Professor Robin Yates, and he talked, there's a lot has been done in Sun Tzu and Cheng Ho and Chinese martial arts, but little done promote nurturing, Needham studies of gunpowder technology and its circulation, and that should be something central because it affected all the civilizations. And finally, Professor Raymond Lau is critiquing our whole position here of dialogue and circulation, because essentially what he's saying is, okay, so there are all these circulations and dialogues, but you have not really explained why it was Europe that brought these knowledges together to create modern science. Of course, those who don't believe there is such a thing as a scientific revolution and modern science would dispute that. But he has an interesting answer. And so I think what he has raised, as our plenary first speaker also mentioned, and others following, there are a lot of questions that require answers, which we are only now beginning to address. Because in the past, we worked within civilizational tunnel histories, and now we're trying to get beyond it. And this conference is certainly a great start on the way, and it ties in with what the Joseph Needham Foundation, as well as, people working in the Needham legacy are also trying to do. With that, I will end, this session. Thank you. Great.